I don't know if we're going to get a bell or not, but it's about time for us to begin, so I think we should probably plan to do that. Well, I'm glad to see everybody this morning, and there's the bell. Okay. Now, now we're official. Glad we can be together this morning. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Father, we pray that we would always look to you and to your word to guide our lives, and we pray that you would open our hearts and minds to your truth this morning. And we pray that as we worship you, as we give our gifts to support the work of the Red Bank Church, and as we pray for each other, that you would bless our time together. And this we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So we are going to try to cover 5 chapters in Exodus today, and so we're not obviously going to go verse by verse exactly, but we're going to hit some of the different points and hope that we can make it through to chapter 24. So let's, I'm a teacher, so I have to give a pop quiz now. So let me see, how many of the 10 commandments can we remember off the top of our heads? What's one of them? Do not kill. Yeah, so far I've got that one down. Do not commit adultery. Okay, kill, adultery. We got the biggies. Don't steal. Okay. What's another one? Honor your father and mother. Do not lie. Do not bear false witness. I think we're up to 5 now. That's pretty good. No idols. Yeah. She said no idols. Do not worship any idols. No graven images. No coveting. That's the hardest one probably. No other gods. If I'm keeping track correctly, then we've got 8. There's one that we probably don't think about a lot. Yeah, there's coveting, but there's one that we don't actually literally keep the Sabbath. We don't literally keep the Sabbath, but the Sabbath principle is still there. I think is there one we forgot, or did we get them all? How about the one that involves speech? Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. We probably think of that in terms of swearing or oaths and things like that. But yeah, good. Everybody got an A. Good for you. Another name for the 10 Commandments, or I guess a nickname, is the Decalogue. Deca meaning 10 and log meaning words. So basically 10 words. And when we go to chapter 20, the first thing that is listed in chapter 20 are these 10 commandments. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. We, in our country, in our culture, our background, we don't really think about setting up, a statue or something like that and bowing down to it, as is the case in other parts of the world. But do we have other images that we worship? That maybe some of them are unseen, but it's the idea of just another God. Now, this isn't really this isn't a God, but it has images on it, and I spend a lot of time on it. Television, what about our jobs? What about hobbies? What about other people? Anything that we substitute for the worship that rightfully belongs to God, if that has first place in our lives, it's the same thing, even if we don't literally, physically bow down to it. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. It doesn't say don't swear, don't curse. There are other places in the Bible that address that, especially in the New Testament, what we do with our speech. But invoking the name of God for your own purposes without rightfully showing him reverence, saying, I swear to God this is true when you know in fact that you're lying, or something of that nature. Right. When you go into a courtroom in our country and you're under oath and they ask you to so help me God. And there are even people who will say they won't swear to God. They say, literally, I won't do that, but I solemnly affirm that what the testimony I give is going to be true. And it's because of this. They say, I won't even do that. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This commandment that was given to the Hebrews as they were coming out of Egypt and heading toward the Promised Land, this was unique in the world. In all other cultures, every day there was a day you worked. In the Greek culture, the only time they didn't have a day during the week where they didn't work, but they would have festivals and different things like that every once in a while. But here God specifically says, set aside one day and rest and focus on other things. So in our own lives, and sometimes we may think, well, now, as Christians, this is our Sabbath, but this is the first day of the week, but it's not the Sabbath. It's not literally the same thing. It wasn't meant to replace the Sabbath. But there is a need in our lives to have space, to rest, and sometimes it's not possible for that to be maybe an entire day. I think of somebody who's maybe a farmer or other occupations where something has to be done every day, but some way of our setting aside time to rest. And I think that's an important lesson in our culture today, especially because we have so many means of just, keeping things going 24/7. That's not good for us. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. we hear this in the New Testament as well. In Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, Paul quotes this, and he said, this is the first commandment with a promise. So if, of these 10 commandments, this is the first one where he actually promises something if you do this. And then here are the biggies that are usually easy to remember. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. In some translations, and maybe in the translation you read, or the one we think of from what we call the King James Version, it says, thou shalt not kill. But the word in Hebrew is actually murder. It's the idea of something that is intentional and premeditated. So that's why I'm glad that the NIV translation has it as murder, because that's really the idea here. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, if you think about it, coveting is not something that you do in the same way that you steal or murder or do something like that. But it's the whole thing of attitude. And it's really interesting that we get to this 10th commandment, and it really has to do with a heart attitude. It's like where your focus is. And we live in an age where we're surrounded by advertisements and all of those sorts of things. And what are those advertisements intended to do? They're intended to make us covet and say, I want that, I need that. Now, this says specifically, don't look at your neighbors and say, I should have that. If you covet something, what might you be willing to do to get it? You might be willing to do anything. You might murder or steal or, lie or do any number of things. We think about how many things can come out of that. So God is saying, this should not be the way you look at each other or look at life, no matter what it is. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. We think of fear as being something that's negative, is not good, right? But what is the difference between the kind of fear maybe we feel of something, and the fear of God that's being talked about here? What is the fear of God? Yes, and I believe, yeah, Bernie, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think that's actually in more than one place. I think it's in the Psalms, and I think it's also in Proverbs. But again, that's not a bad kind of fear, is it? So when we talk about the fear of God, and we're told to fear God, so that must not be a bad thing. What does that really mean? The motivation of the fear of God is so that the response of our lives will be for good. And many times we fear so many other things in life, such as something that could happen to us, whether it's illness or accident or, other people or any number of things. Fear is a very real emotion. And fear is, it's not wrong to be fearful. I mean, you can't help the way you feel, but to give into it. But if your fear is transferred to, as long as I fear God, He's number one. I give Him awe, and I realize that He has the right as the God of the universe to do with me as He wills. And, we realize as Christians, our position with God is not because of something we have done, uh, but it's because of what Christ has done, and in accepting His sacrifice on our behalf and in giving ourselves to Him, we then, have that relationship with God that is otherwise not possible. So, we could say, since discipleship has been an ongoing theme that we've been considering now for a couple of years, is the idea that to be a disciple is to fear God in that sense, and that's a good thing. But the people were still afraid of God, of this, awesome display that they saw here on the mountain. And that was a good thing, because by realizing that this was not a God to be trifled with, this is not like the gods of Egypt that you could, set up some sort of idol and worship and then go and do as you please. This was not like those gods of Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold." He said, I'm not going to be one of your gods. I'm going to be the God. And nobody else is going to be in my place. For the next few chapters, we're going to go through here and consider some of these different categories that are covered. That the Ten Commandments, is almost sort of like a summary, we could say, of a lot of these. But then there are specific commandments that God gives His people. And this is, really unique when we look at this because of all the different aspects of life that are addressed here. And then others are addressed later on in Exodus and Leviticus and some of the other books of the Pentateuch that Moses wrote. But what's interesting is to read this and then to think about what we have in our own legal system, in our justice system, that we have some familiarity with, and then to see how much of the principles that we have put into our legal system are based on these very things from Exodus. Hebrew servants. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. Why do you think the 7th year? Why? What's the significance of that if it's 7? Think about the Sabbath, the 7th day. So the 7 was this sort of number of holiness or perfection, right? And so 6 years, and then you're free. In our own country, we had, when many people were coming to the Americas, to the colonies, there were people that would be what were called indentured servants, and they couldn't afford passage on the ship. But what they agreed to do is, if I can go along on this ship and go with you, if you'll pay my passage, then I'll work for you for a specified period of time to pay off the debt, and then I'll be free to do whatever, to do as I please, to make my own life. So that was an agreement, and it's similar to this. In our country, when we had slavery before the Civil War, the unfortunate thing is many times Christians who said, slavery it's fine if we do that, they would point to passages like this and say, well, they had slaves then, so it must be okay for us to have slaves. But then when we get to reading what it says about what you're to do with slaves, that's not the way slaves in America before the Civil War were treated. They weren't treated in that way. So the thing should be, if you're going to say that it's okay to have slaves because, they did back in the Old Testament, then shouldn't you do everything they did in the Old Testament? But, that didn't hold any water, unfortunately. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So, we think eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Here's a case where it says, if you mistreat your slave to this extent to where you're, causing this kind of injury that's going to affect the rest of their lives, the contract that you made with them is over. You have to free them. There are, again, as I said, we're not covering every situation here, but I think we're going to see in some of these other cases, because where it addresses some of these things, there's the idea of the difference between intent and accident and what the consequence needs to be for each of those. Yeah, that's another good question, is that as long as I don't knock out your eye or your tooth, I don't think that's the intent. I would certainly hope not. But it's the idea of, they're a servant, but they still have rights. They still need to be treated fairly. And then we go into personal injuries, and so this is where, I can't help thinking about all the commercials that I see on television these days about people offering their services. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God let it happen, they are to flee to a place that I will designate. And so they had cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed somebody and then the family is going to come after you, there were places in the Promised Land where you could flee to, and basically you had to be kept safe there. But if you left the city, all bets were off. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die, but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. So different levels of guilt, we would say, or when it comes to something like this. And so, we also understand if we keep up with legal proceedings, or maybe have watched enough Perry Mason or something like that, that we understand that there are different degrees of murder. So anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow, and if it's done intentionally, we would call that what? First degree murder, right? And then you have cases where, second, third degree, if there are other circumstances at work, or there's also manslaughter. And so in our legal system, we recognize that, intent is an important thing. And, this is an example of really where this started. It's not just, if you kill my brother, whether it's accidental or not, I'm going to kill you. God said, no. Here are the things that need to be examined, and many times bring it before the judges or the authorities to make that determination. But then we also have the thing of, compensation. If you're injured, then, the question is, if somebody's injured, but, they have a chance to recover, that's good. But then the time they weren't able to work, you have to compensate them for that. There's a principle that in legal terms, in Latin, lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. And this puts limits on punishment. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Where was this second verse quoted in the New Testament? Jesus quoted it, didn't he? Jesus said, "You've heard it was said, uh, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I say to you," what was in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus put forth another principle. Someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other to him. Okay, so it's not retaliating. Now, Jesus wasn't saying by that saying that this is a bad law. What he was saying was, what people would do with this is to say, okay, well, if you did this to me, then I get to do the same thing to you. And that is not what God is saying here. The idea of limits on retaliation is to say, if you're injured somehow by someone, don't go to the extreme in terms of retaliation. And we see cases where somebody accidentally does something, and then somebody else just really goes after them in a big way. I remember even seeing this true with kids when I was teaching school in Memphis, and I was teaching music classes, and so the kids would come and they would line up, and kids sometimes they're not watching where they're going. This little kid would come and he would bump into somebody. It was an accident. And most kids understood that, but there'd be some kids that would turn around and they just go, bam. I taught in a tough neighborhood, so those kids were kind of rough and tumble, but it was this, and I had to say, no, wait a minute, that was an accident. You can't do that. So then, the retaliator was in more trouble than the one who had bumped into him. But it's a natural thing to do. And again, children have to be taught that, and apparently adults do too. Bernie.
Say this. My son was about 5 years old when I take this photo. He hit another kid. And the lady who was in charge of that part of the program brought the other kid back over and said, "Ted, he just hit you." I objected to it.
Yeah,
Because I said, "You're teaching Ted."
Right.
As well as the other boy.
Right. That's a thing where you're like, yeah, I wouldn't.
I was an elder at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I probably didn't do it gently.
But you were rather direct with her, I would imagine. Yeah, which is understandable.
I didn't get angry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But she didn't like it.
Mm-hmm. Now, whether you know it, if you have children, you're automatically a judge, right? Because your children come to you with situations and you have to decide, are they telling the truth? What really happened here? Especially if you have more than one. Okay, what you say, this happened, he said, she said, and then you have to figure it out. So you have had to exercise wisdom in human relationships. Or maybe not even with children, but if you're in a work situation and things go awry, you have to figure out how do we settle this. So this whole thing of human relationships, but also not going to the extreme, not acting out of the emotion of the moment in terms of what you want to do to somebody when there's some sort of injury or offense or something like that. God is telling these people at this time, you need to wait, you need to back off, and you need not to go to the extreme when there's something like this that happens. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. It needs punishment has to be addressed. So it.
So I didn't tell her.
Right.
She should.
Yeah.
She should have proved to them.
Yes. No, and it's probably a situation where, she realized afterwards, she goes, oh, I didn't really handle that the right way. So that's the other thing is, before I was a parent, I was a teacher, and I was playing policeman and judge and everything all the time with lots of children who weren't my own. But, there were still the expectations of you better get it right because, uh, that's an important point, Gerald. Thank you for bringing that out because you got to remember these people had been slaves in Egypt for more than 300 years, and now they're going to go out and they're going to become a nation. Well, what have they been conditioned by? Life in Egypt and the way that was. This was nothing like the way people were treated in Egypt. These sorts of things. So, and what's interesting is, as you said, this may seem harsh to us, but do you know why it seems harsh to us? Because we're in a culture, we live in a country that our legal system and our society and our way of life have been governed by the Judeo-Christian principles of this is the way this should be done. So, we just take it for granted that, well, of course, this makes sense. But, in looking at this saying, this was really new for these people. And of course, we know that they didn't live up to it, did they? They tried, and in some cases they didn't try very hard, but they weren't even able to do it. Restitution. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So you think about this. If you steal something and you're caught, okay, you got to do this much more again. So one of the things many times in the justice system that several groups are working towards is instead of incarcerating someone who has committed a crime, are there cases where it's possible for them to make restitution instead so that they make good on it? But then we have, maybe one less person that is, in jail for a particular period of time. That's not possible in every case, obviously, but this is an example of the principle is not simply that you pay back, but you have to pay back more. So that would make you think, is it worth me? I'm coveting my neighbor's oxen. Is it worth it for me to steal if I'm going to have to then go out and get 4 more and, or 5? What is it? 5. Okay. That could be a pretty good deterrent. But it's this idea of if you steal something, you need to pay it back. And we're going to have to kind of skip over some of the other details. But there's also this aspect of social responsibility. This first one, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And there are other places through these chapters where God comes back to this. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. Remember, you were aliens and you're going to this land. The way you treat people who are not, part of the Jewish nation or what will become the Jewish nation, you still need to treat people decently. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. God is trying to develop a heart of compassion in his people. And he says, this is the way you need to look at one another. You need to take care of one another, and you need to take care of anyone who is in your midst. Of course, this was before social media. Do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. It's easy to fall into that. And sometimes it's easy to fall into that maybe without meaning to. But we need to really think about what we say. So this addresses the whole thing of our speech and what we say and that responsibility. Again, we come back to the Sabbath laws. Here, the Sabbath law is applied to agriculture. For 6 years, you're to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the seventh year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So there's the principle of letting this lie fallow. So things will still grow, and then let people come and gather. So this is a means of letting the poor people, the people who have needs, come and gather, and it'll be free to them. Any of you come from families or have maybe relatives who were farmers? Okay, so Debbie, did your father then, was there part of the fields that would lie fallow for a while and they would just not plant something? Okay, so it's mainly raised cotton. Mm-hmm. Cotton and corn. Ah, oh, that sounds nice. Yeah. So different kinds of crops. We think about crop rotation, but sometimes there's the principle of just let's let this land lie fallow for a season and kind of recover, rebuild the soil and all of that. So just like we need to be replenished and rebuilt and have a time for us to rest, God's saying, do this with your land, because it will take care of. It's good for land management, but it's also good for the people around you who have needs, and they're still going to have to go gather, so they're still going to do work, but they can gather it from a place in which they have permission to do it, and otherwise they wouldn't be shut out that way. There are 3 feasts that are still observed actually by Jewish people to this day. The Festival of Unleavened Bread, and they do this in the month of Aviv, in the month that they came out of Egypt. So what's another name for the Feast of Unleavened Bread? The Passover, yeah. So this is talking about the Passover feast. And so this is the one that they had actually already celebrated. Then you have the Festival of Harvest, or the Festival of First Fruits of the crops you sow in your field. And this is one that comes 50 days after Passover. Does that sound familiar to us? What is the festival that comes 50 days in the spring after Passover? Pentecost. We read about it in Acts 2. So all these people had come to Jerusalem for this festival of harvest, for Pentecost, and that's when the church was established. So Jesus died at Passover, Jewish festival. The church was established at Pentecost, another one of these festivals. And then finally, the Festival of Ingathering. Another name for this happens in the fall, and actually I think we've already gone through it, but this is known as Sukkot, or booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, other ways of describing that. Also, when I was in Memphis, one of my part-time jobs was I taught music classes at the Jewish Community Center in Germantown. So this was like music classes for these 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids. And I was there in the fall, so I was there when they were celebrating some of these feasts and teaching the kids about them. And I remember they have the little Sukkot, as they called it. And so the kids would go in their classes and they'd get branches and all of these things, and they would build these little lean-to shelters that were similar to what we read about here, that actually is described more clearly in other places in the Pentateuch. But they would build these little shelters because they're teaching about this is what the Jewish people, your ancestors, this is what they did when they came out of Egypt. So, a very clear lesson like that. But it was interesting to see them teach, these preschoolers about this part of their heritage, and actually, something that comes from the Bible, from the Old Testament. God promises that when they go into the land, He's going to help to clear the path for them, so that when they go in, they'll, because this is the land that other people are living now, but he's going to help to clear it so that they can move in. But they're still going to have work to do in terms of what they do. But he says, I'm not going to drive them all out at one time. It's going to be a gradual process, and there's things that you're going to need to do. But notice here the last verse, do not make a covenant with them or their gods, which is the easy thing to do, is to say, well, but God had a very different thing in mind. We're clearing them out, and you're coming in. And they were being cleared out because of their sin, because of the way they were living at the time. That is the Hittites, all of these Hivites and Jebusites and all the other people who were living in Canaan at that time. Moses went and told all the people the Lord's words and laws. They responded with one voice, everything the Lord has said, we will do. Notice this. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. So here we have, a record within the Pentateuch of this is when Moses starts writing down all of these commandments and the things that were eventually part of the Bible. And then there's this covenant ceremony that they go through. They do a sacrifice, and some of the blood is sprinkled on the altar. The rest of the blood is sprinkled on the people. I don't think it was sprinkled on every single person, but I don't think that would be possible. But it symbolized that you are entering into a covenant with God. Who had God entered into a covenant before this? Abraham. And if you remember, I think Steve talked about this last time. A covenant was to cut an animal, divide it in half, and then both parties walked through the middle, which was kind of gross, but that's the way they did it at that time, and that signified that we will both keep this covenant. And it's also implicitly saying if we don't, then the same thing that's happened to this animal is going to happen to us. So it's very serious. In this case, God is making a covenant with them with his law and saying, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people. And it's confirmed with blood. Then there's a third covenant that's yet to come. And that's the covenant that he makes with us, that he actually makes with the entire world. He says, when Jesus came and gave himself for everyone, that was also a covenant that was confirmed with blood by his death on the cross. But now it's not limited to simply the Hebrew nation. It's available to the entire world, to anyone who will come by faith. But again, here, when this ceremony, when Moses is receiving the law and telling the people about this, then God